The lunch rush at the cozy corner was in full swing, with the usual symphony of clinking plates, murmured conversations, and the occasional laughter from customers filling the air. Daniel Parker moved through the restaurant like a well-rehearsed performer on a busy stage, his apron tied tightly around his lean frame and his notepad tucked securely in his pocket. At just 26 years old, Daniel had mastered the art of serving customers with a genuine smile, no matter how tired or stressed he felt inside. That day, however, was already proving to be a challenge. A couple at table 3 was complaining about their soup being too cold, while a family at table 7 demanded more ketchup with an impatience that bordered on rude. Daniel juggled it all with practiced ease, his polite responses and calm demeanor masking the exhaustion he carried after years of long shifts and sleepless nights. Then the door swung open, and in walked a man who immediately stood out from the crowd. He was tall, with a salt and pepper beard trimmed to perfection, and wore an impeccably tailored suit that whispered of wealth and power. The man's polished leather shoes barely made a sound as he strode across the floor, his sharp eyes scanning the room before settling into a quiet corner by the window. Daniel approached with his usual professional demeanor, holding a menu and greeting the man with a warm smile. "Good afternoon, sir. Would you like to see our specials today?" The man glanced up, his expression tired yet commanding. "No, thank you," he replied, his voice low and gravelly. "Just a coffee. Black." Daniel nodded, scribbling the order down on his notepad, though he didn't need to. Coming right up, he turned to walk away, but hesitated, glancing back at the man. There was something in his eyes, an almost imperceptible heaviness, like the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. Moments later, Daniel returned with the coffee, setting it down carefully in front of the man. "Here you go," he said, his smile genuine. "If you need anything else, just let me know." The man gave a curt nod, barely acknowledging the gesture. But Daniel didn't take offense. He'd seen that look before. People came to the cozy corner for more than just food or coffee. Sometimes they needed a moment of peace, a place to escape whatever storm was raging in their lives. As he moved to leave the table, he paused again and, almost without thinking, added, "This one's on house." The man's gaze snapped up, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "Why would you do that?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Daniel shrugged, his easygoing smile never faltering. "It's just coffee," he said simply. "Sometimes everyone needs a little kindness." For a moment, the man said nothing, his piercing gaze locked on Daniel's face as if trying to decipher his motives. Then, finally, he gave a small, almost reluctant nod. "Thank you," he said, his tone softer this time. As Daniel walked away, he couldn't help but wonder about the man. Who was he? What was weighing on him so heavily? But the demands of the restaurant quickly pulled him back into the chaos of the lunch rush, and the mysterious customer faded into the background of his thoughts. Meanwhile, the man sat quietly, sipping his coffee and watching Daniel from across the room. There was something about the young waiter that intrigued him, his calmness under pressure, his unwavering kindness even when the restaurant buzzed with complaints and demands. It wasn't something the man encountered often in his world, where transactions were cold and relationships were calculated. The coffee grew cold as the man's thoughts drifted, and when he finally stood to leave, he hesitated. Reaching into his wallet, he pulled out a crisp $100 bill and placed it on the table under the empty coffee cup. Then, almost as an afterthought, he grabbed a napkin and scribbled a quick note. Kindness doesn't go unnoticed. When Daniel returned to clear the table, his eyes widened at the sight of the bill and the note. His first instinct was to run outside and return the money, but when he looked out the window, the man was already gone. He held the note in his hands for a long moment, a mix of surprise and gratitude washing over him. As the day wore on, Daniel found himself thinking about the man more and more. It wasn't the generous tip that stuck with him, but the note. There was something about it, a quiet promise, perhaps, that made him feel like the coffee he had offered had meant far more than he could have imagined. Little did Daniel know that small act of kindness had planted a seed in the stranger's mind, a seed that would grow into something far greater than either of them could foresee. The tall man in the tailored suit, Mr. Harris, couldn't shake the memory of Daniel's simple act of kindness as he rode home in the back seat of his chauffeured car. The city lights flickered past the tinted windows, but his mind was elsewhere. The free coffee had been unexpected, sure, but it wasn't the gesture itself that lingered. It was the way Daniel had offered it, with no ulterior motive, no expectation of anything in return. It was such a rarity in Mr. Harris's world of boardrooms and business deals, where every action was calculated for maximum gain. As the car rolled to stop outside his penthouse apartment, Mr. Harris stepped out and paused at the door, looking up at the towering building. He had everything anyone could ever want: wealth, power, influence. But that simple moment in the restaurant had unsettled something deep within him. When was the last time someone had shown him an act of pure kindness? More importantly, when had he done the same for someone else? Inside, the penthouse was pristine and impersonal, the kind of place that looked more like a showroom than a home. Mr. Harris loosened his tie and poured himself a glass of whiskey, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city below. He took a sip, savoring the burn, but the thoughts in his head refused to quiet. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he landed on a familiar name. Claire, his trusted assistant, picked up on the second ring. "Good evening, Mr. Harris," she greeted him with her usual efficiency. "Claire," he began, his voice thoughtful, "I need you to look into someone for me. His name is Daniel Parker. He's a waiter at the Cozy Corner downtown." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by Claire's professional reply. "Of course, sir. What exactly are you looking for?" "Everything," Harris said simply. "Background, family, financial situation, whatever you can find. And make it discreet." The next morning, as Harris sipped his coffee in his penthouse office, Claire arrived with a neatly compiled file. She handed it to him without a word, her expression curious but professional. Harris opened the folder, his eyes scanning the pages inside. What he read stopped him in his tracks. Daniel Parker was 26 years old, a high school graduate with no college education. He'd been working at the Cozy Corner for 4 years, often pulling double shifts to make ends meet. His mother, Sarah Parker, had been diagnosed with a chronic illness that required expensive treatments, leaving Daniel as her primary caregiver. Despite his modest income, he had no outstanding debts, a testament to his disciplined budgeting and relentless work ethic. As Harris read on, he learned about Daniel's small acts of generosity. Co-workers described him as someone who always lent a helping hand, whether it was covering shifts or offering emotional support during tough times. Customers left glowing reviews about his kindness and genuine warmth, often singling him out by name. Harris closed the file, leaning back in his chair as a strange mix of emotions coursed through him. He admired Daniel's resilience and selflessness, but he also felt a pang of guilt. Here he was, a man who had more money than he could ever spend, and yet he couldn't remember the last time he'd done something to genuinely help someone. "Claire," he said, his voice breaking the silence, "give me a reservation at the Cozy Corner tonight, and prepare something special for Daniel." When Harris arrived at the restaurant that evening, the atmosphere was just as lively as the day before. He was greeted with the familiar hum of conversations and the clinking of dishes, but this time, he wasn't just another customer. He had a purpose. Daniel approached his table with the same warm smile, though there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Good evening, sir. Coffee again, or something more tonight?" Harris chuckled, his demeanor lighter than before. "Coffee will do for now, but I think we have some unfinished business to discuss." Daniel looked puzzled, but didn't press further, returning moments later with Harris's coffee. Throughout the evening, Harris watched Daniel work, observing his interactions with customers and co-workers. He noticed the way Daniel handled difficult situations with grace, always managing to diffuse tension with a kind word or a joke. It was clear that Daniel wasn't just a good waiter. He was someone who genuinely cared about the people around him. As the night wound down, Harris signaled for Daniel to come over. "Take a seat," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Daniel hesitated. "Sir, I'm still on shift." Harris waved a hand dismissively. "Don't worry about that. Sit." Reluctantly, Daniel obeyed, his expression a mix of curiosity and unease. Harris studied him for a moment before speaking. "Do you know why I'm here tonight?" Daniel shook his head. "Honestly, no. I assumed you just liked the coffee." Harris smiled. "I did. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because yesterday, you did something most people wouldn't. You gave me a free coffee. A small gesture, but one that carried a lot of weight. You didn't know who I was or what I could do for you, and yet you chose to show kindness. That's rare." Daniel shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with the praise. "It was just coffee," he said quietly. "No," Harris said firmly. "It was much more than that. And now, I want to return the favor." Before Daniel could respond, Harris reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. He slid it across the table. "This is for you. Open it when you get home." Daniel stared at the envelope, his mind racing with questions. "Sir, I don't." Harris held up a hand, cutting him off. "No arguments. Just take it. And be ready. This is only the beginning." With that, Harris stood, leaving a bewildered Daniel sitting at the table. As he walked out of the restaurant, Harris felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose. That night, as Daniel sat at his small kitchen table and opened the envelope, his breath caught. Inside was a letter and a check for an amount that seemed impossible. The letter was brief but powerful. "Kindness doesn't go unnoticed. Let's see where yours can take you, Harris." Daniel sat at his kitchen table, staring at the check and the letter as if they might disappear if he blinked too long. The sum written on the check was astronomical, enough to cover his mother's medical expenses for months, maybe even years. The letter, with its simple but profound message, left him more bewildered than ever. "Kindness doesn't go unnoticed. Let's see where yours can take you." What did Mr. Harris mean by that? What exactly was he trying to do? The following day, Daniel couldn't focus. His shift at the Cozy Corner felt like a blur of orders and table rotations, with the letter and check occupying his every thought. His co-workers noticed the change in him, casting curious glances his way, but Daniel wasn't ready to share what had happened. He wasn't sure he even understood it himself. Later that evening, as the last customers trickled out of the restaurant, Daniel found himself lingering by the counter, hesitant to leave. His manager, Carla, approached him with a knowing look. "You've been off all day," she said. "What's going on?" Daniel hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. Then, in a quiet voice, he explained what had happened with Mr. Harris, how the millionaire had returned, handed him an envelope, and left without much explanation. Carla's eyes widened as he showed her the check. "Daniel, this is incredible," she said, her voice hushed. "What are you going to do?" "That's the thing," Daniel admitted, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. It feels like too much. I mean, why me? I'm just a waiter." Carla placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're not just anything, Daniel. You've got a heart that most people don't. Maybe Mr. Harris sees something in you that you don't see in yourself yet." Her words stayed with him as he walked home that night, the city's cool air doing little to clear his racing thoughts. When he reached his apartment, his mother was waiting up for him, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a scarf. "You're late," she said, glancing up with a smile. "Busy night?" "Something like that," Daniel replied, setting his bag down. He debated whether to tell her about the check and letter. On one hand, he didn't want to worry her or give her false hope. On the other, he couldn't keep something this big from her. Finally, he sat down across from her and place the letter and check on the table. Her hands stilled as she picked up the letter, her eyes scanning the words. Then she looked at the check, her mouth falling open in shock. "Daniel, what is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It's from a customer," he explained. "A man named Mr. Harris. He says he wants to help me because I gave him a free coffee." Sarah shook her head in disbelief. "This is more than help, Daniel. This is life-changing." "That's what scares me," Daniel admitted. "I don't know what to do with it. What if it's a mistake? What if I don't deserve it?" His mother reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "You deserve every bit of kindness that comes your way, Daniel. You've given so much of yourself to others. It's time you let someone give back to you." The next day, as Daniel prepared for another shift, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. The number was unfamiliar, but he had a feeling he knew who it was. Taking a deep breath, he answered. "Hello? Daniel," came Mr. Harris's smooth voice. "I trust you received my letter." "I did," Daniel replied, his voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through him. "And I wanted to thank you, but I don't understand why you're doing this." "Because kindness is a rare thing," Harris said simply. "And when I see it, I believe in nurturing it. But this is just the start, Daniel. I have a proposition for you." Daniel frowned, his heart pounding. "What kind of proposition?" "Meet me at the restaurant tonight after your shift," Harris said. "I'll explain everything then." True to his word, Mr. Harris arrived at the cozy corner that evening, this time alone, and without the air of mystery that had accompanied his previous visits. He sat at his usual table, sipping his black coffee as he waited for Daniel to finish his shift. When the restaurant finally quieted, Daniel approached the table, pulling out the chair across from Harris. "I'm here," he said, trying to mask the nervousness in his voice. "What's this about?" Harris leaned forward, his expression serious but not intimidating. "Daniel, I believe in investing in people. Not just businesses, not just ideas, but people. And I see potential in you. You're kind, hardworking, and selfless. But you're also stuck. You've spent years giving to others without ever thinking about what you might need for yourself." Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I don't know about all that," he said. "I'm just doing what I can." "Exactly," Harris said, his tone firm. "And that's why I want to help you. I've already taken the liberty of enrolling you in one of the best culinary schools in the country. Full tuition, room and board, all covered." Daniel's jaw dropped. "Culinary school? I've never even considered that." "Well, it's time you did," Harris said with a faint smile. "You've got the heart for it, Daniel. The rest can be taught. But more than that, I want to give you the tools to build a better life. Not just for yourself, but for the people around you." For a moment, Daniel was too stunned to speak. The weight of the offer, the sheer generosity of it, was overwhelming. "Why me?" he finally asked. "Why go through all this trouble for someone like me?" Harris's gaze softened. "Because someone did it for me once. And because the world needs more people like you. People who remind us that kindness isn't just a word, but an action." As Daniel left the restaurant that night, his mind raced with possibilities he'd never dared to dream of. Culinary school, a future beyond the cozy corner. It felt too good to be true, but for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to hope. The morning sunlight filtered through Daniel's apartment window, casting a warm glow across the modest room. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the envelope from Mr. Harris and the accompanying acceptance letter from the culinary school. Every word on the paper felt surreal, like they belonged to someone else's life, not his. He ran his fingers over the embossed seal of the Culinary Academy, the reality of the offer sinking in slowly but surely. His mother, Sarah, shuffled into the room, her steps slow but steady. She placed her hands on the back of a chair, her sharp eyes scanning the papers spread across the table. "Still thinking about it?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded. "It's not an easy decision, Mom. I mean, culinary school. It's a dream. But he gestured to their surroundings, the piles of medical bills stacked neatly in the corner. It feels impossible to leave everything behind. Sarah smiled gently as she sat across from him. Impossible? Daniel, you've made the impossible happen every day for years. You've worked harder than anyone I know to keep this family afloat. Maybe it's time to believe in something for yourself. Her words echoed in his mind as he walked to work later that day. The cozy corner was already bustling when he arrived, the familiar sounds of clinking plates and lively chatter pulling him back into his routine. But no matter how busy the restaurant got, the weight of Mr. Harris's offer lingered in the back of his mind. As the lunch rush began to taper off, Daniel found a rare moment to catch his breath. He leaned against the counter, wiping his hands on his apron, when Carla, his manager, approached. She held 2 cups of coffee, offering him one with a knowing look. "You've been distracted all day," she said, leaning against the counter beside him. "Still thinking about that offer?" Daniel sighed, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. "How could I not? It's the chance of a lifetime, but what if I fail? What if I leave everything behind and it doesn't work out?" Carla chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Daniel, you're one of the most hard-working and resilient people I've ever met. You've been managing this place like a pro for years, handling tough customers and crazy shifts without losing that kindness of yours. Trust me, if anyone can handle this, it's you." He looked at her, his brow furrowed. "But what about the restaurant? What about you guys? I feel like I'd be abandoning everyone." "Don't worry about us," Carla replied with a grin. "We'll manage. Besides, you're not doing anyone any favors by staying here when there's a whole world waiting for you out there." Their conversation was interrupted by a familiar figure walking through the door. Mr. Harris, dressed sharply as always, entered the restaurant with his usual air of quiet authority. He glanced around before spotting Daniel and giving him a slight nod. Daniel felt his heart race as Harris approached the counter. "Daniel," Harris greeted him, his voice smooth and steady. "Do you have a moment?" Daniel exchanged a quick glance with Carla, who gave him a subtle thumbs up before stepping away. He removed his apron and followed Harris to his usual corner table, feeling a mix of nervousness and curiosity. Once they were seated, Harris leaned forward, his expression calm but purposeful. "I'm not here to pressure you," Harris began, his tone kind. "But I do want to answer any questions you have. I know this decision isn't easy, and I don't expect you to jump into it without hesitation." Daniel hesitated, gathering his thoughts. "It's not that I don't want to go," he admitted. "It's just everything here feels so uncertain. My mom, the bills, this job. It's all I've known for so long. What if I take this leap and fail?" Harris nodded, his gaze steady. "That's a fair question. But let me ask you this. When was the last time you did something for yourself, Daniel? Not for your mother, not for the restaurant, but for your own growth and happiness." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but found himself at a loss for words. He couldn't remember the last time he had prioritized himself over his responsibilities. Harris continued, his voice softening. "You've spent years giving everything you have to others. That's admirable, but it's not sustainable. This opportunity isn't just about culinary school. It's about giving yourself the chance to build a better future, not just for you, but for the people you care about." Daniel leaned back in his chair, the weight of Harris's words settling over him. He wanted to believe in the possibility of a brighter future, but the fear of the unknown held him back. "What if I'm not good enough?" he asked quietly. Harris smiled, his eyes warm with encouragement. "Daniel, I've seen enough of the world to know one thing for certain. Success isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up, working hard, and being willing to learn. You've already proven you have the drive and the heart. The rest will come." The conversation left Daniel with more questions than answers, but it also planted a seed of hope. That evening, as he walked home, he replayed Harris's words in his mind. He thought about his mother's unwavering support, Carla's encouragement, and the opportunities that lay ahead if he dared to take the leap. Back at his apartment, Sarah was waiting for him, a soft smile on her face as she noticed the change in his expression. "You've made up your mind, haven't you?" she asked. Daniel nodded slowly. "I think I have." "Good," she said, her voice filled with quiet pride. "Because you deserve this, Daniel. And no matter what happens, I'll be here cheering you on." That night, for the first time in years, Daniel allowed himself to dream. He imagined the bustling kitchens of culinary school, the smell of fresh ingredients, and the thrill of creating something extraordinary. The fear was still there, but it was outweighed by something stronger: hope. The evening air was crisp as Daniel arrived at the cozy corner for what he thought would be a normal shift. He had spent the entire day preparing himself mentally for the decision he was about to share with Mr. Harris. After weeks of uncertainty, he had finally decided to take the leap. Culinary school felt terrifying, but the idea of letting this opportunity slip away felt even worse. As he tied his apron and greeted his co-workers, Carla gave him a curious look. "You're glowing today," she teased. "Does this mean you've finally made up your mind?" Daniel smirked, his nervous energy giving him away. "Let's just say tonight's going to be a little different." The dinner rush began as usual, with the restaurant humming with its familiar mix of conversations, clinking plates, and the occasional burst of laughter. But something felt different. There was an unusual buzz in the air, and Daniel noticed several unfamiliar faces among the patrons. They weren't the typical neighborhood crowd. These people exuded a sense of purpose, like they were here for more than just a meal. As Daniel worked his way through the tables, taking orders and delivering plates, he noticed Mr. Harris arrive, dressed as sharply as ever. But this time, he wasn't alone. He was accompanied by two men and a woman, all equally well-dressed, who carried an air of quiet authority. They were seated at Harris's usual table, and Daniel's curiosity piqued as he approached to greet them. "Good evening, Mr. Harris," Daniel said, offering his usual warm smile. "Back for more coffee?" Harris chuckled, his tone lighter than Daniel expected. "Not tonight, Daniel. Tonight's a little special. But don't worry, you'll find out soon enough." Before Daniel could respond, Carla appeared at his side, her expression unusually serious. "Daniel," she said, "can you step into the back for a moment? There's something you need to see." Confused, Daniel followed her to the kitchen, where a small group of co-workers had gathered around a large box sitting on the counter. His name was written on the lid in bold letters. "What is this?" Daniel asked, his voice filled with suspicion. Carla smiled, gesturing for him to open it. Inside, Daniel found a pristine set of professional chef's knives, each one gleaming under the kitchen lights. There was also a chef's coat with his name embroidered on the chest, along with a beautifully crafted leather-bound notebook labeled Recipes and Dreams. At the bottom of the box was a handwritten note from Mr. Harris, "A small token for your journey. The best tools deserve the best hands." Daniel felt his breath catch as he ran his fingers over the items. The knives were heavier than they looked, perfectly balanced and razor-sharp. The chef's coat felt like a second skin as he slipped it on, and the notebook. The notebook felt like an invitation to dream bigger than he ever had before. Before he could process what was happening, Carla nudged him. "There's more," she said, her grin widening. "Go back out front." As Daniel stepped into the dining area, the restaurant fell silent. The patrons, all of them, turned their attention to him, and it was then that he realized many of them weren't strangers after all. There was Mrs. Thompson, the elderly woman he always made time to chat with during her weekly visits. There was Mr. Alvarez, who owned the bakery down the street, and the Jones family, who always asked for a section when they came in for Sunday brunch. These weren't just customers. They were people whose lives he had touched in small but meaningful ways over the years. At the center of it all was Mr. Harris, who stood and raised his glass. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice commanding yet warm, Tonight, we celebrate someone who embodies the kind of kindness and dedication we all strive for. Daniel Parker has spent years serving this community with a heart as big as this city. And now it's time for us to give something back. The room erupted into applause, and Daniel felt his cheeks flush as every face turned toward him. He tried to protest, to wave off the attention, but Harris held up a hand to silence him. Daniel, he continued, you've been given a gift, not just the gift of opportunity, but the gift of being seen. Your kindness doesn't go unnoticed, and tonight, we're here to show you what that kindness can inspire. Harris gestured toward the group seated with him. Allow me to introduce some friends of mine. Chef Andre is one of the most renowned culinary experts in the country, and he's here tonight because he believes in your potential. Next to him are Ms. Whitaker and Mr. Lang, representatives from the Culinary Academy you'll be attending. They've come to ensure that your transition into this new chapter of your life is as smooth as possible. Daniel's head spun as he tried to process everything. He felt a mixture of gratitude, disbelief, and overwhelming emotion as Harris continued. But that's not all. The people in this room, your friends, your coworkers, your customers, they're here because you've touched their lives. And tonight, they want to show you just how much you mean to them. One by one, people began to stand and share stories about how Daniel had impacted them. Mrs. Thompson spoke about how Daniel's kind words had lifted her spirits after her husband passed away. Mr. Alvarez shared how Daniel had once stayed late to help him carry supplies when he was short-staffed. Even Carla chimed in, talking about how Daniel's steady presence had kept the restaurant running smoothly during the toughest of times. By the end of the night, Daniel was overwhelmed with emotion. As the crowd dispersed, leaving him with a box full of gifts and a heart full of gratitude, Harris approached him one final time. Daniel, he said, placing a hand on his shoulder, this is just the beginning. You've got a long road ahead, but you won't be walking it alone. You have a community behind you, and you have the potential to do something truly extraordinary. Daniel looked at him, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I don't know how to thank you, he said softly. Just keep being you, Harris replied with a smile. That's more than enough. That night, as Daniel walked home under the glow of the streetlights, carrying the tools of his new journey, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Certainty. For the first time, he wasn't just hoping for a better future. He was stepping into it. The next morning, Daniel woke up with a mixture of excitement and unease. The events of the previous night replayed in his mind like a vivid dream. The applause, the gifts, the heartfelt stories from the people he'd served, it all felt overwhelming. And then there was Mr. Harris's speech, his confidence in Daniel's potential. It was as though everyone around him could see a version of himself that he couldn't quite believe in. Sitting at the small kitchen table with a cup of coffee in hand, Daniel stared at the pristine chef's coat hanging on the back of a chair. The sight of his name embroidered on the chest was surreal, a tangible reminder of the life that was now within his grasp. Yet, as much as he wanted to embrace it, doubt lingered in the back of his mind like a shadow. His mother, Sarah, shuffled into the kitchen, her robe wrapped tightly around her frail frame. She paused when she saw him, a knowing smile spreading across her face. You're quiet this morning, she said, sitting down across from him. Something on your mind? Daniel let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. It's just a lot, Mom. Everything that happened last night, the school, the restaurant, it feels too big, like I'm stepping into shoes that don't fit me. Sarah reached for his hand, her grip gentle but firm. Daniel, those shoes fit you better than you think. You've spent so many years working tirelessly for everyone else. Maybe it's time you believe in yourself the way everyone else does. He looked at her, his expression conflicted. But what if I'm not good enough? What if I fail? I've never done anything like this before. Sarah's smile softened, her eyes filled with quiet wisdom. Everyone starts somewhere, Daniel. And failing isn't the end. It's how you learn. But staying in one place because you're afraid to try, that's the only real failure. Her words hung in the air as Daniel nodded slowly, the weight of her encouragement beginning to settle over him. Still, the fear of leaving behind the life he knew, the safety net of his job at the cozy corner, the routine he'd grown accustomed to, kept him tethered to his doubt. Later that day, Daniel decided to clear his head with a walk through the city. The familiar streets, bustling with activity, brought him a sense of comfort. He passed the bakery owned by Mr. Alvarez, who gave him a wave and a thumbs up through the window. Further down, he spotted Mrs. Thompson sitting on a bench, feeding the birds. Her face lit up when she saw him, and she waved him over. "Daniel," she exclaimed, her voice warm. "I've been thinking about you all morning. Last night was something special, wasn't it?" He chuckled, sitting beside her. "It definitely was. I still can't believe it happened." She patted his hand, her expression earnest. "You deserve every bit of it, dear. You've been a light in this community, even when you didn't realize it. Now it's your turn to shine." Her words echoed his mother's, and Daniel couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. But as he continued his walk, his thoughts shifted to the practicalities of the decision before him. Culinary school would mean stepping into a world he knew nothing about, surrounded by people with far more experience. Could he really measure up? When he returned home, Daniel found a letter waiting for him on the kitchen counter. His mother must have retrieved it while he was out. The envelope bore the elegant logo of the Culinary Academy, and inside was a detailed itinerary of his first week of classes, along with a personal note from Chef Andre, one of the instructors he'd met the night before. "Daniel," the note read, "I've heard nothing but good things about you, and I look forward to seeing what you bring to the table. Remember, no one expects perfection, only passion and effort. That's what makes a great chef." Daniel read the note twice, then a third time, letting the words sink in. It was reassuring to know that even the experts didn't expect him to have all the answers. But the fear still lingered, whispering that he wasn't ready. That evening, Daniel found himself back at the cozy corner, not as a waiter, but as a visitor. The restaurant was quieter than usual, the dinner rush just beginning. Carla spotted him immediately and rushed over, a grin spreading across her face. "Well, if it isn't the man of the hour," she teased. "What brings you here? Missing us already?" Daniel laughed, but his smile quickly faded. "I needed to talk to you," he admitted. "I'm having second thoughts about everything." Carla's expression grew serious as she gestured for him to sit at the counter. "Okay, spill it. What's going on?" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "It's just, what if I'm not cut out for this? What if I'm making a huge mistake?" Carla crossed her arms, leaning on the counter as she studied him. "Daniel, do you know how many times I've seen you handle situations here that would make most people quit on the spot? Angry customers, double shifts, equipment breaking down. You've dealt with all of it, and you've done it with a smile. If you can handle that, you can handle anything." He looked at her, his brow furrowed. "But what if I fail?" Carla leaned closer, her voice firm but kind. "Then you fail, and then you get back up and try again. That's how life works, Daniel. No one gets it right the first time, but the people who succeed are the ones who don't let failure stop them." Her words struck a chord, and for the first time, Daniel felt a small but steady resolve building within him. He wasn't sure what the future held, but maybe, just maybe, he was ready to find out. As he left the restaurant, the cool night air felt different, lighter, as if the weight of his doubts had started to lift. When he returned home, he found his mother waiting for him, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on another scarf. "Mom," he said, his voice steady, "I've made up my mind. I'm going to culinary school." Sarah looked up, her eyes shining with pride. "I knew you would." That night, as Daniel lay in bed, he thought about the road ahead. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be without challenges, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Hope. And as he drifted off to sleep, he knew that this was only the beginning of the journey. The first day of culinary school arrived faster than Daniel had expected. As he stood outside the towering building that housed one of the most prestigious culinary academies in the country, his nerves threatened to overwhelm him. The sleek glass facade reflected the city skyline, a stark contrast to the small, cozy world of the cozy corner he had known for years. Clutching his leather-bound recipe notebook, a gift from Mr. Harris, Daniel took a deep breath and stepped inside. The lobby was buzzing with activity, filled with students from all walks of life. Some looked as nervous as he felt, while others moved with the confident air of seasoned professionals. The smell of fresh herbs baking bread and something slightly smoky hung in the air, a tantalizing promise of what was to come. Daniel approached the registration desk, where a cheerful woman handed him a name tag and a packet of information. "Welcome to your first day," she said brightly. "Orientation starts in room 204. Good luck." As he made his way to the classroom, Daniel couldn't help but notice the state-of-the-art facilities. Kitchens gleamed with stainless steel, their countertops spotless and lined with equipment he'd only ever seen on TV. Students practiced knife skills at one station, while another group worked on delicate pastry techniques. It was both inspiring and intimidating. When he entered room 204, the atmosphere shifted. The room was filled with rows of neatly arranged desks, and at the front stood a tall man with salt and pepper hair and an air of authority. Daniel immediately recognized him. Chef Andre, one of the most respected culinary experts in the country. "Good morning, everyone," Chef Andre began, his voice commanding yet warm. "Welcome to the start of your culinary journey. Over the next year, you'll be challenged, pushed to your limits, and asked to question everything you think you know about food. But if you're here, it's because someone saw potential in you, and I intend to help you live up to that potential." Daniel found a seat near the back, hoping to blend in. As the chef continued his introduction, Daniel's mind raced with doubts. What if he couldn't keep up? What if he was out of his depth? He glanced around the room, noticing how prepared some of the other students seemed. Many of them carried custom knives, high-end chef coats, and an air of confidence that made him feel like an outsider. But then Chef Andre's words cut through his anxiety. "Let me make one thing clear," the chef said, pacing the front of the room. "This isn't about where you come from or what you already know. It's about where you're willing to go and how hard you're willing to work to get there." Daniel straightened in his seat, the weight of those words settling over him. He didn't have years of experience or formal training, but he had something just as important: determination. The first few weeks were grueling. Each day started early and ended late, with hours spent mastering the basics. Knife skills, sauces, plating, nothing came easy, and Daniel often found himself falling behind his peers. His hands ached from endless chopping, and his mind spun as he tried to memorize recipes and techniques. There were moments when he wanted to give up, moments when the voices of doubt grew louder than his resolve. One particularly difficult day, Daniel found himself assigned to prepare a classic hollandaise sauce. It seemed simple enough, just egg yolks, butter, and lemon juice. But under the watchful eye of Chef Andre, the task became daunting. Daniel whisked furiously, his brow furrowed in concentration, only to watch the sauce separate into a grainy mess. "Stop," Chef Andre said, his voice calm but firm. He stepped closer, inspecting Daniel's failed attempt. "Do you know what went wrong?" Daniel shook his head, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I thought I followed the steps, but it just fell apart." The chef nodded, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You were too focused on the end result. Hollandaise requires patience, balance. Cooking isn't just about following steps. It's about understanding the process." He demonstrated the technique, his movements smooth and deliberate. Within minutes, the sauce came together, silky and perfect. Handing Daniel the whisk, Chef Andre said, "Now you try again. Remember, It's not about perfection. It's about progress. Daniel took a deep breath and started over. This time, he moved slower, paying attention to the texture and temperature of the ingredients. When the sauce finally came together, he felt a swell of pride. It wasn't perfect, but it was his. As the weeks turned into months, Daniel began to find his rhythm. He stayed late after class to practice, often enlisting the help of classmates who were more experienced. Slowly but surely, his skills improved. He learned to fillet fish with precision, bake soufflés that rose beautifully, and create intricate dishes that showcased his growing confidence. But the most significant moment came during a team challenge. The students were tasked with creating a 3-course meal, working together to showcase their individual strengths. Daniel was hesitant at first, unsure if his ideas would measure up. But when his teammates struggled with a dessert, he stepped forward with a recipe he had been working on, a twist on his mother's apple pie. The dish was a hit, earning praise not only from his teammates, but also from Chef Andre. "This," the chef said, holding up a forkful of the pie, "is why we cook. Food that tells a story, that comes from the heart. It's what makes us chefs." For the first time, Daniel felt like he belonged. He wasn't just keeping up, he was thriving. The doubts that had plagued him began to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence. He wasn't perfect, and he still had a long way to go, but he was no longer afraid of the journey. As the semester drew to a close, Daniel found himself standing in the academy's kitchen late one evening, the room quiet and empty. He thought back to the night Mr. Harris had handed him a letter that changed everything. In that moment, he realized how far he had come, not just in his skills, but in his belief in himself. He picked up his notebook and began jotting down ideas for new recipes, his mind brimming with possibilities. The fear that once held him back was now a distant memory, replaced by something far more powerful: hope. The day had finally arrived. Daniel stood outside the grand doors of Kindness Kitchen, the restaurant Mr. Harris had so generously gifted to him, and felt a wave of emotions wash over him. The space, once an idea scribbled in a note, was now a reality. The name, chosen to honor the small act of kindness that had started this journey, glowed warmly on the sign above the door. Today, it wasn't just about opening a restaurant. It was about stepping fully into a life Daniel had only dared to dream of. The restaurant was buzzing with activity as Daniel walked in. His team, chefs, servers, and hosts, were busy with final preparations. The stainless steel kitchen gleamed under the bright lights, stocked with the finest tools and ingredients. The dining room, elegant yet inviting, was a reflection of Daniel's vision. A place where people could come not just to eat, but to connect, to feel at home. Daniel called out Carla, his former manager from the Cozy Corner. She had joined his team as the restaurant's front-of-house manager, a decision Daniel had made without hesitation. "We've got everything ready. First reservations start in an hour, and the press is already outside." "Press?" Daniel asked, his brow furrowing. Carla grinned. "Of course, press. Your story's gone viral, remember? Everyone wants to see the restaurant that started with a free coffee." Daniel chuckled nervously, running a hand through his hair. The attention was still something he was getting used to, but he reminded himself that this wasn't just about him. Kindness Kitchen was a community effort, built on the support and encouragement of so many people who believed in him. As the clock ticked closer to opening, Daniel took a moment to step into the kitchen, where his team was assembling. The chefs, many of whom were former classmates from culinary school, looked to him with anticipation. He cleared his throat, his nerves giving way to a quiet determination. "Today isn't just about serving food," he began, his voice steady. "It's about sharing a piece of ourselves with everyone who walks through those doors. Every dish we make, every plate we serve, is a chance to show what kindness can create. Let's make this a place where people feel seen, cared for, and inspired." The team erupted into cheers, their energy infectious. Daniel felt a swell of pride as he watched them scatter to their stations, ready to bring his vision to life. The first guests began to arrive soon after, and Daniel greeted them personally at the door. Among them were familiar faces: Mrs. Thompson, who had insisted on being the first reservation, Mr. Alvarez, carrying a fresh loaf of bread as a gift, and the Jones family, whose kids were now a little older, but just as excited to see him. Each guest had a story connected to Daniel, and seeing them fill the restaurant felt like a homecoming. But the most poignant moment came when his mother, Sarah, walked in, her steps steadier than they had been in years. She wore a soft smile, her pride evident as she took in the bustling dining room. "You did it, Daniel," she said, pulling him into a hug. "You really did it. It's because of you, Mom," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You taught me everything I know about resilience and kindness." As the evening unfolded, the restaurant hummed with the sounds of laughter, conversation, and the clinking of glasses. The dishes leaving the kitchen were met with awe and delight, each one a reflection of Daniel's journey. His signature dessert, a twist on his mother's apple pie, quickly became a favorite, drawing smiles and nostalgic stories from the guests. But it wasn't just the food that made the night special. Daniel had dedicated a section of the restaurant to a pay-it-forward initiative where guests could purchase meals for those in need. Throughout the evening, the generosity of the patrons brought tears to Daniel's eyes. Kindness Kitchen was becoming exactly what he had envisioned, a space where kindness could ripple outward and touch lives far beyond its walls. Toward the end of the night, Mr. Harris arrived, his presence as commanding as ever. He watched from the corner as Daniel moved through the restaurant, greeting guests, checking on tables, and occasionally stepping into the kitchen to lend a hand. When Daniel finally noticed him, he walked over, a wide grin spreading across his face. "Mr. Harris," he said, shaking his hand. "I didn't think you'd make it tonight." Harris chuckled. "You think I'd miss this? I had to see for myself what you've built." The two men stood in comfortable silence for a moment, taking in the scene around them. "You know," Harris said finally, "when I gave you that free coffee, I had no idea it would lead to this. But I'm glad it did. You've done something incredible here, Daniel." Daniel shook his head, his humility shining through. "I couldn't have done it without you. You believed in me when I didn't even believe in myself." Harris smiled, his eyes twinkling. "And now it's your turn to believe in others. Keep paying it forward, Daniel. That's the real legacy." As the night drew to a close, Daniel found himself standing outside the restaurant, the quiet hum of the city wrapping around him. He looked up at the sign glowing above the door, Kindness Kitchen, and felt a sense of fulfillment he had never known before. This was more than a restaurant. It was a testament to the power of small acts, the ripple effect of kindness, and the strength that comes from believing in oneself. Daniel had taken the leap, faced his fears, and built something extraordinary. And as he stood there, watching the last guests trickle out with smiles on their faces, he knew this was just the beginning. The journey of kindness was far from over, and he was ready for whatever came next. And now, I want to hear from you. Which part of this story touched your heart the most? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. And of course, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more narratives like this. Each subscription helps us continue bringing exciting stories to you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.